Gotta be honest, I'm super pumped to jump into this episode of Fruits Basket. There's a whole lot to unpack here, and after last episode, I thought it was going to be a tough one to follow, especially after having another Zodiac member's curse break. But arguably, this episode delivered on a higher note, leaving barely any room to digest each key moment before jumping into another. Just before I start though, I will say I have read the manga and I'm aware of all relevant future plot points and details. But for the sake of the review, I like to focus solely on the anime plot. It saves me comparing the differences between the anime and the manga, and it makes it easier to focus purely on the review of the story being told. Plus, this means anime onlys can join in too without fear of being spoiled for future plot points. Now with that being said, let's get started. We start off seeing Tohru and Yuki visiting Haru and Rin at Kazuma's, and the sheer happiness that Tohru has making a new friend in Rin is pretty adorable to say the least. And this, alongside the commentary by Haru being happy for Rin, is a fairly strong start to the episode. And to be honest, after the previous episode, I wasn't expecting Haru to tell Yuki where Rin was being kept, especially considering how he decided to keep it private initially. But then we learned that it was for Tohru's sake, and that's all the more sad, but it's also pretty thoughtful. Because God knows Tohru's been struggling enough as it is. And even though the other Zodiacs don't really know all about it, it's still sweet that they try to protect her in their own way. And on top of that, the solemn reflection between Kazuma, Haru and Yuki about how Rin was being kept in the cat house and how Kyo's destined for that soon is all the more sad. It always kind of felt like it was a far away problem for the future. But then you look at how young Yuki and Haru are, and it really shocks you into thinking about how Kyo himself has barely begun to live his life, and he's going to be condemned to a lifetime of imprisonment, for no reason at all, and it's pretty depressing. And then leading straight on from that, we have Kyo talking about how Rin staying with Kazuma would be good for him, because he won't get lonely. Initially you think this was just an off-the-cuff comment, only to realise that he's probably thinking long-term, and it's no coincidence that he mentions this right after the discussion of his own confinement. On a subconscious level at least, he's still thinking about the people he cares about and wanting them to live a good life, regardless of his own fate. On top of this, we learn that Tohru's mum's death anniversary is upcoming, and Yuki offers to go along, but Kyo says that he can't. It's pretty subtle, but you can tell that Tohru's disappointed, and it's interesting to see that her true feelings are kind of opening up more and more the longer she gets comfortable with the Somas. Initially in the story, she wouldn't have let on that she did actually mind, but now it's becoming a little bit more obvious. And then we head into one of the more heavy scenes of the episode, where Shigure decides to confront Rin after her stint in the cat house. He calls her out for being reckless in her attempt to break the curse and reveals that Ren would have just led her on and that she has no idea how to break the curse. He goes on to tell her that regardless of her actions, he believes the curse is going to break and that they are the final generation of the Zodiac. Of course, Tohru happens to be there at the time and overhears everything. And she questions when the curse will break, urging them that it has to be soon, otherwise Kyo's going to get locked away. And then she turns to Shigure and questions him as to whether he knew the curse was going to break after all this time. He plays it down though, saying that there was no way for him to be sure, but he gathered information. And that this has been the only time that all the other Zodiac members have been alive together. He theorized that it was because they were meant to have a final banquet, and he brings up Kurino, whose curse is already broken. Obviously, Rin's confused by that, and Shigure, seemingly an oversharer today, makes it abundantly clear that he's no longer the same as the other Zodiacs, and confirms that he's no longer tied to the curse like the others. Not only that, but Kurino also believes the curse is going to break, just like Shigure. Shigure goes on saying that every other member of the Zodiac knows what's going to happen to Kyo. That he's going to be locked up and they'll do nothing to stop it because for them, he's their scapegoat. Someone worse than them. Shigure attempts to go on, but Tohru stops him. He questions if she's mad at him, to which she tearily shakes her head. He reassures her that Kyo's curse will eventually break, but asks why eventually isn't good enough, and whether she's trying to save him. He then goes on to ask whether she loves him, but he can't even finish his question before she runs off. And we conclude the scene with Rin asking if Tohru truly loves Kyo, to which Shigure just smiles. And there's so much to break down here. Now it's interesting that Shigure intentionally went to visit Rin in the first place, and that he was planning on telling her this information about the curse breaking. This would either benefit him for moving along the time it would take for the curse to break, or he doesn't want it to die, which she's been close to a number of times, otherwise her Zodiac spirit would have to be reborn, and that could harm their chance of breaking the curse. But it also seems kind in his own way to tell her the truth. He knew how much she longed to break the curse, and this would bring her some peace of mind in the end. I think one element that he wouldn't have expected though, was Tohru being added to the mix. But obviously, as he's already orchestrated for Kurino to tell her the truth about Akito and the curse, he decides to fully commit and tell her his own theory about the curse breaking. What I found interesting is the way that Tohru questions Shigure. She seemed arguably angry and hurt that if he was so sold on the idea that the curse would break, why wouldn't he have shared it with the others? It's different to her reaction when Kurino told her about his bond breaking. There seems to be more judgment and wounding from Shigure considering how close they are. It's pretty painful for her. It seems though that despite his theories, he wasn't actually fully sure until he talked with Kurino and found out that his thinking aligned with his. But now it's finally out in the open between Shigure and Tohru that they're both aware about Kuruno's curse, and Rin seems to be caught in the crossfire learning all of this for the first time. Interestingly, Shigure brings up the fact that all the Zodiacs are aware of what will happen to Kyo, and I hadn't really thought about it, but from Tohru's perspective, it seemed a secret that only people close to Kyo, like Kazuma, would know. And this has got to feel like even more of a betrayal. Shigure owns it in a way and confesses on behalf of all the Zodiacs that they're monsters, and I found this an interesting choice of words. Obviously, everyone's aware that the cat's perceived as a monster due to its true form, but you don't really ever hear apart from Akito this kind of degrading label used for the other Zodiacs. It's pretty easy to see that Shigure's being objectively cruel here in the way he's explaining this to Rin and Tohru. But the way he degrades the Zodiac for letting the cat be locked up and calling themselves monsters feels like a double meaning. It feels like he's disgusted that they would even do this, that they're all self-serving. Obviously, it all gets too much for Tohru, and as soon as she puts her hands out to stop him, he questions if she's mad at him. But he doesn't do this in the same way he's been talking to them before. It seems like a genuine check to see how far he's allowed to keep pushing. When she says that she isn't, he starts by reassuring her that the curse will eventually break, and then proceeds to push her towards her true feelings for her to realise her love for Kyo and admit it to herself. And of course, this pushes her over the edge and causes her to run away. And I think seeing Shigure smile in the end can immediately be read as if he's happy he's been cruel to her, but I don't think that's true. Sure, he's selfish in pushing for what he wants and going by any means necessary, but it seems more like he's happy that everything's going to his plan, and that he gets confirmation that she does love him and will hopefully lead to the curse breaking in the future. In the past few episodes, we've really seen a different light to Shigure, one that can be really polarizing. And I understand that a lot of people don't like him, but to me, I still feel like he's almost a chaotic good. Sure, he can be manipulative and will go to any lengths to get what he wants, but arguably what he wants isn't that bad. It's for the good of all the Zodiacs. And I just don't think that his goal to break the curse is solely so that he can just have Akito. Sure, it's the primary reason, but it's not like he doesn't care about the other members at all. I think he does want them to be happy too, and we know that he does care about Tohru to some extent. Despite his harsh words in the moment, it still felt calculated, and he made sure to say the right things to provoke her in the right way without going overboard. We then see Tohru heading home in the same way we did in Season 2 after she left her grandfather's place, where she seemed to be swaying, struggling under her own pressure and worries. She reflects back to when Rin asked her what's most precious to her, and she couldn't give a straight answer, knowing that the true answer was Kyo. But she felt as though she was betraying her mother, and that she'd forget about her if she put someone else first. And it's pretty awful how tortured she's become at the thought of not only forgetting her mother, but the horror that she could lose Kyo as well. Then, just like last season, Kyo comes back with his Chad energy at the perfect moment, and he doesn't push her to talk and offers advice that will ease the pressure off in a way that no one else ever has. He allows her to be vulnerable instead of trying to fix her problem, and is just there for her. And it's so sweet that they just keep proving how they fit together perfectly. Tohru even admits to herself in the end that she knows who she'll choose, and we all know that's Kyo. Interestingly, we see Kyo visit Kyoko's grave, regardless of what he said before, and he comes across Toru's grandfather. And we have this cute moment where Kyo immediately worries for him since he said that he strained his back, but he's reassured almost just as quickly. It almost feels very Tohru-esque, and it shows how caring Kyo can be despite his prickly demeanour at times. Then they idly chat for a little while until Kyo asks him why he keeps calling Tohru Kyoko, worrying it's not a good thing for Tohru to hear. And whilst he admits that it's not ideal, he says he does it to preserve his memory of her, echoing the previous scene where Tohru feels that she'll lose the memory of her mother if she isn't the priority in her heart. He goes on to explain why Tohru talks so politely, as an imitation of her father, so that way she resembled him. And this shows how her father's side of the family sneered at Tohru, and how there were expectations put on her at such a young age. It shows a less put together Tohru, one that's weak and needs to be loved just like anybody else, and would do anything to achieve that. And it's a great backstory for her, and highlights how vulnerable she could be, despite how she comes across to the other Zodiacs. We then change scenes to Kazuma's, where Tohru comes to visit Rin, and Kagura hides behind the paper doll while Kazuma says hello. There's this tiny moment where Tohru can tell at the very least that someone's hiding there, and I'd wager she knows it's Kagura. And you can even hear her falter a little when she's speaking to Kazuma before she goes to say hello to Rin. Kagura makes it obvious that she doesn't know how to talk to Tohru now that it's become clear that she has feelings for Kyo and vice versa. But I wonder if Tohru feels sad that it's led to a rift in their friendship. After all, Kagura hasn't been present at the more recent get-togethers involving the younger Zodiacs. And whilst you could assume that's because of her admission to Kyo, it still feels like it's not completely resolved. And Kagura admits that, but I feel like it was obvious Tohru was feeling it too, which whilst not explicitly stated, was an interesting moment. Then we head straight into a heavy scene. Tohru had initially come to apologise to Rin for running off, but she didn't mind, and instead wanted to know why Tohru loved Kyo, wondering if it was out of pity. At the same time as this is going on, Kazuma tells Kagura about how his grandfather conceived a child with his caretaker and had her as his companion. But she was with him out of pity, not true love, and he hopes that this isn't the feeling that Tohru has. We then switch back to Tohru, who explains to Rin that it's not out of pity. Her feelings are all-consuming and, in her own words, greedy. She feels as though she hides behind the noble act of trying to break the curse for everybody, but in truth the person she cares most about is Kyo, and she can't bear to lose him. Kagura, obviously triggered by Kazuma's story, storms up the stairs, listens to Tohru's confession, then straight up slaps her and tells her to confess this to Kyo. And there's a whole lot to unpack here. We finally get the words coming out of her mouth that she loves Kyo. We got Kyo to say it in the first half of last season, so I'm glad we finally got to see Tohru's perspective. Her and Rin have such a unique bond, different to all her other friends, and even though she isn't the closest to her, it still felt understandable that she was the one she confided in. They're both willing to go to such desperate lengths for the people they care about, not unlike Shigure. And it was also cool that we got a follow-up from Kagura for feeling guilty about pitying Kyo, and it's clear that she's harbouring some anger against Tohru in a way for loving Kyo in a way that she can't. It felt like that slap was really just her taking out her frustrations on her, rather than for the sake of Kyo. Also, I never really liked Kagura that much, but I feel like this was so uncalled for. She's way down on the unlikable list for me now, especially after something like that. We then switch straight back to Kyo and Tohru's grandfather, where he continues his story about how Tohru coped after her father's death. And I found it so perfect that straight after Kagura hits her, the first words that come out of her grandfather's mouth were, "Dear Tohru took that cruelty to heart." Foreshadowing right there. Most likely leading to a confession down the track, I'd say. In any case, we learn how lonely Tohru felt after her father's death, where her mother was clearly in the throes of severe depression. She was neglected, lonely, and fearful of losing her mother too, and in an attempt to make her stay with her, she actively decides to mimic her father so that she'd be happy. And that's just so depressing. We then get another teaser look at Kyoko and Kyo's relationship from when he was young, and it's clear that Kyo's become a little confidant, learning about Tohru and her family. Kyo reflects on how lonely Tohru looked even as a child, and he wonders if that's truly who she is even after all these years later. Just a lonely little girl. And you can't help but see Tohru in such a different light now, as a vulnerable girl who just wants to be loved, despite appearing outwardly strong and together. Back at the house, Kyo approaches Tohru as she's hanging a sheet out on the line. Kyo then decides to test Tohru based on what he learned from her grandfather, diving straight in about her dad. And you can see that she immediately looks shaken by the question, and to be honest, you can't help but feel sorry for her here. Sure, Kyo needs to learn this information and she needs to be able to open up, but the poor girl's been pushed so hard emotionally over the past few days, she needs a moment to breathe. You can see that it pains her to say that she doesn't look like her dad, but she almost reflects fondly that her mother thought she spoke like him. Kyo then reassures Tohru, saying that it would have made her mother happy. Even though it's a nice thing to say, it seems to trigger Tohru's doubts, and she opens up to him, telling him the truth about her mimicking him so that it seemed like she had something in common with him. She goes on to say that in her mind, she'd decided that her father was the enemy, despite knowing that he wasn't, knowing that he was a good man. But that if he could threaten to take her mother away, she couldn't bear it. So she imitated him to keep her alive and with her. She goes on to say that she feels guilty about pinning the blame on her father, and feeling selfish for doing anything to keep her mum with her. And to be honest, my opinion is the same as Kyo's. It's really pretty foolish, a child's reasoning to get their parent to stay. And to be honest, my heart broke a little hearing a young Tohru trying to imitate her father, for her to keep at it and try to hide how lonely she truly felt. But most of all, it was sad for her blaming herself for doing this in the first place, feeling guilty like it was wrong. It's such a sad but sweet moment, and you can't help but love how much Kyo understands and reassures Tohru in all the right ways. He tells her that her mum probably figured it all out and that she would have appreciated it, and that Tohru helped her along. Despite her apologising for airing her problems, he refuses to hear it, saying it's all okay and that he's always going to be there for her no matter what. And then the hug with the sheet was so precious, and the fandom as one collectively shed all the tears. And that's arguably one of the most emotional moments in Fruits Basket for me. It was such a sincere and beautiful thing. It perfectly encapsulates the essence of their trust and love in each other and shows how Kyo truly understands her like no one else can. She deserves him, just as much as he deserves her. And of course, Kagura has to rip us out of our emotions in the next scene with her pathetic whining about how Tohru and Kyo are in love. And I'm sorry, but I have no sympathy for her. We already had her storyline in Season 2, she needs to get a grip. I'm all on Rin's side here. She's getting annoying. Back at the Somas, Tohru goes to show Kyo a photo of her father that she kept in a frame with her mother. And this cues the reminder from Kagura to confess her love to Kyo. She attempts to pluck up the courage, but then all of a sudden, she sees that her mother isn't in the photo and instead sees a silhouette of her mum behind Kyo, and all the guilt about putting him first rushes back. And to be honest, this moment completely freaked me out. That would be super scary to see. Then, to top it all off, we have a double thriller as Kyo's triggered by his old cap and he sees Tohru's mum's bloodied body dead on the ground. He goes on to say that he'd blocked the memory out, but it comes back and is followed by a vision of Kyoko's bloody face saying, "I won't forgive you." Pretty ominous and pretty scary. And poor Kyo looks scared out of his wits, and to be honest, who could blame him? It scared the crap out of me. For a brief moment, I forgot what anime I was watching. It changed genre so fast. Tohru notices how distressed Kyo looks and very symbolically drops the photo frame of her mother, which shatters, representing her priority shifting towards Kyo. And at the very end, we hear Kyo say that he remembers now, Tohru screaming his name, and Kyoko saying, "I won't forgive you," as the episode ends in black. And that was a crazy ending. And I really liked that episode. The Fruits Basket train just keeps on charging and picking up speed at an alarming rate. The episode was so good, and I can't wait for the next one. That being said, those are just my thoughts, and now I'd like to hear yours. What did you think of the episode? Like it? Hate it? Make sure to leave a comment and let me know.